They baptized him with the name of Pythagoras, just as the philosopher. Since he was little, he was really curious about knowing the origin of the appellative. As soon as he knew about the greatness of the mathematician and philosopher that made the name famous, he insisted on believing that he descended from the eminent Greek, and he called himself Pythagoras II. That way, he convinced himself that the gene router in the pre-Socratic had passed through multiple generations until it reached him. Hence, being proud of being a bearer of such a superb lineage, he was forced to be worthy of his very ancient and very well-known ancestor. He insisted on studying conscientiously Pythagoras' philosophy and his brilliant mathematical discoveries. He inquired into the reasons why Aristotle asseverated that Pythagoras was named by the school of Croton founded by himself around the 6th century BC. Hyperborean Apollo, which means the Apollo of distant land, which according to Herodotus was located somewhere in the northeast of Asia. In the opinion of Pausanias, it was further than Boreas' home, which according to Homer the poet was in Thrace. Hence, Hyperborea was in the north of Thrace, in Dacia. Plutarch related them to the Gauls. The Stoic Heracles of the 2nd century BC considered the Hyperborean as Scythians. In diverse writings, it was agreed that Pythagoras was Hyperborean, despite the fact that he was originally from the Ionian island of Samos. In what everyone seemed to coincide was that Hyperborea was one of the Terrae Incognita. Some placed it in Great Britain or beyond the Wend. In addition, they agreed that the natives of those lands got to live thousands of years in full happiness. Threatened by the musical notes as part of the order and the laws established there during Apollo's visits. Pythagoras II was fascinated with the idea that his old ancestor was from Hyperborea. As a result of his wisdom, knowledge, and his mystic vision of music. Another attribute that dazzled Pythagoras about his remote relative was his exceptional character. By not falling into the distance that other Greek philosophers had from the mythical while they got closer to the natural. In contrast, the great mathematical philosopher didn't opt for the mythical religious versus reason. What was evident in the sublime fame, both as great scientist and an outstanding religious which he had amongst the ancient. The epigons of Pythagoras centered in mathematics as determinant and regulator of the natural phenomena. The science and religion, that in the intellectual perception of the philosophers of the period gradually turned into Antipodean. In Pythagoras seemed to reconcile. The development of his philosophy and science were developed in the Orphism, religious movement based on a combination of legends and beliefs practiced by Orpheus, the Thracian poet. Pythagoras insisted on a system of beliefs that combined the myth and mysterious religions, while he developed scientific contributions in the mathematical field, of great value to subsequent Western thinking. The young Pythagoras II learned a lot from the teachings of the great Greek thinker from whom he believed he descended from. Nevertheless, something did not make sense to him. He came back again and again to the Hyperbolia issue. He was particularly intrigued with the idea that it was located, as some pointed out, beyond the wind. At the beginning, he did not understand it. As he moved on his scientific studies, he noticed that a place could not really exist because the wind had a great importance. A world without wind was inconceivable. For the philosophers of ancient Greece, air was one of the four essential elements of the universe, along with fire, dirt, and water. The wind is the driving force of air. Without wind, there would not be pollination, nor seed spreading, nor wind energy, neither the birds could fly. Then young Pythagoras II wondered, how could they have imagined that Hyperbolia could be located beyond the wind? That is to say, where there was no wind. That was impossible. That is why he got to the conclusion that it was all about a metaphor. Certainly, besides thinking of Hyperbolia as an extremely remote land, it was considered as a lucky earth paradise, where human beings lived happily in total harmony, accompanied by music and tranquility. By virtue of this, what had to be done first to understand the sense of the metaphor was the complete happiness was only found where there was no wind, because the wind was understood as a disturbing force, source of many harm and tragic events. Something that for many cultures might seem rare or even absurd, in the thinking of the Greeks of that time, it made sense. The Greeks in general and the great pre-Socratic thinkers, the Cretan Mycenaean culture, the Ionic, etc., were Islanders. Hence, the strong wind caused them great misfortunes, so that the phrase beyond the wind could be interpreted as the place where calm and tranquility reigned. Based on that thinking, Pythagoras II understood the sense of the metaphor and decided to move the Ólafsvík, the quietest place he found after exhaustive encyclopedic search. The little town of Ólafsvík was found in the peninsula of Snæfellsnes in Iceland. He built there the school of Croton II, held by 20 Neo-Pythagorean followers who, following the ancient Pythagoras, dressed simple with garments made of helm materials in white colors. But due to the extreme cold of that country, they couldn't avoid wearing wool. Unlike the original Pythagoras, who avoided because they considered it impure. Just as their ancestors, they were vegetarians with an ascetic, organized, disciplined, and serene lifestyle. They were dedicated to the systematic study of mathematics and relaxed with music in which the Pythagorean scale prevailed based on the succession of fifths and octaves, using the monochord as main instrument. The guiding idea, directly inherited from the distinguished ancient sage, consisted in considering music much more a science than an art. The wind was blowing, but they fell beyond that. Due to the tranquility in which they lived, isolated as a Pythagorean sect. The peace and harmony of the sect endured some years, until an extraordinary glacial flood reached them with a colossal vigor. The inhabitants of the peninsula were warned by the media, but Pythagoras' second decision of being kept isolated in their extreme sect prevented them of being informed of the disaster that was coming and the evacuation measures that should have been taken to prevent the risk. Despite living for a while in the area, they did not know the signals of the animals which a local person would have opportunely noticed. And when they noticed that out into the distance they could see the water flows that reached 1 million cubic meters per second, it was too late. The metaphor, beyond the wind, got an enormous bucket of ice water. The polar ice caps descended along the mountain. Not even the own-payers of their mysterious cult, nor his most sophisticated mathematical calculation to find salvation, could avoid the tragedy. The 21 members of the sect were submerged by the mighty torrent, which drowned them in the icy waters and buried them in its depths. The Hyperborean, located beyond the wind, to ensure them a life filled with millennial happiness, had been totally destroyed. The secret rites, the harmony, the music, and the mathematics were left in nothingness.